Hey, what's up, you guys? I said that as a joke to make fun of the people that do it, but it's actually kind of fun. If you're watching this video, you probably want to know about camera basics, and if you're not here to learn about camera basics, why are you here? Now you should stay. I'm going to explain the settings used in both photos and videos, but they're used differently for each of them, so I'll keep it as clear as I can. To start with, we're going to work with the three most important settings that influence the light in the image, but each of them comes with a trade-off for having more or less light in the image. Those three settings are ISO, shutter speed, and f-stop. I'll start with the easy ones and work my way up. ISO is pretty simple. It's the sensitivity of the camera's sensor to the light that's coming in and hitting the sensor. Turn it down, it's less sensitive, there's less light. Turn it up, it's more sensitive, there's more light. Generally speaking, you want this to be as low as possible and you'll get the cleanest image. The problem with this is that if it's dark and you bump up the ISO to make it more sensitive to the light coming in, you're also introducing more and more grain into the image because the sensor's trying to find anything and it will just... Every camera has a native ISO, which is that specific sensor's ideal level to get the cleanest image. Whatever your camera is, you can probably Google it and find out what the native ISO is, but generally speaking, the lower the better. Some cameras like the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K or 6K have a dual ISO, and it'll automatically switch between them based on which ISO you pick. I'll use the Blackmagic ISO ranges as an example, but the same rules apply to any dual ISO camera, really, you'd think. On the Blackmagics, the first ISO is set between 100 and 1000, and the second ISO comes in at 1250 and goes up from there. The native ISOs are 400 and 3200. If you need to go higher than 400, instead of putting it at 1000, which is at the top end of that ISO and will give you a lot of grain, you should just put it one step further into 1250, which will put it at the lower end of the second ISO, which will get you a cleaner image. The shutter speed and shutter angle relates to how long the camera sensor is open to the light. For example, 1/50 is 1/50th of a second. For photography, you can use this to get a really specific type of image. If you set the shutter speed really high, it makes it open and close really, really fast, which means that you can get a really crisp image of something moving really fast, usually something like cars or sports or... What's sports? What's sports? You can open it up a little bit longer for some motion blur, or you can open it up for a really long time for long exposure photography. For video, it's found that a shutter speed of half a frame is the perfect amount of motion blur to make it look natural and to what our human eye sees. So if you're shooting at 25 frames a second like I am, you should open it up to 1/50th of a second, which is double the frame rate. It's only open for half as long. Maths. Shutter angle is basically the same thing, except instead of using a measurement of time like 1/50, it uses a measurement of 360 degrees, with 180 being half. So if you're shooting at 24 frames a second, you'd want to double it to 1/48th of a second, but your camera might only have settings for 1/40th of a second or 1/50th of a second. So how do you get the perfect angle? I mean, you can use 1/50th, but it won't be perfect. So shutter angle uses degrees per frame. 360 means that it is open for the entire duration of that frame. 180 is half, and you can go anywhere between or lower than that to get the shutter speed that you want. All you need to know for video is that your shutter angle should be at 180 degrees, half the frame, because it'll automatically adjust the shutter speed to whatever you set your frame rate to. So if you want to shoot at really odd frame rates for whatever reason, it'll automatically open it up to double that so that you get the perfect half frame motion blur. 180 degrees is half. Remember that. F-stop, also known as aperture or the iris. The f-stop is a part of the lens with multiple blades that spiral in or out to open and close off the amount of light coming through the lens. The reason it's sometimes known as the iris is because it works very similar to the iris in your eye. It's a circle that gets bigger or smaller depending on the amount of light. So in bright light, your eye's iris will get smaller to let less light in so you can see, if you're outside and it's really, really bright. And opposite to that, it'll open up really wide in the dark to let as much light in as possible so that you can see. The f-stop works in exactly the same way, except it isn't automatic most of the time. The lower numbers open it up really wide to let light in, and the higher numbers close it to let less light in. The easiest way to remember it is that 0 is open. There is no 0 f-stop, but it's an easy way to remember which one's open. The trade-off of how this works is that how much is in focus and your depth of field will change because of, well, physics. All you really need to know is that the more open the f-stop and the more light you have coming in, the shallower the depth of field and how much will be in focus. This can make it really difficult to keep the subject in focus because you've only got, this much depth, and as soon as they move out of that, they'll get blurry. If you increase the number and close it off to let less light in, the more is going to be in focus. To keep things cinematic and have a blurry background with the subject in clear focus, usually you want it to be around 2 to 4. Anything less than 2, it kind of gets too shallow and really difficult to do unless you've got really good autofocus. The fourth one, kind of related, is white balance. White balance is a setting that will make sure you're getting a perfect white image regardless of the source of light that you've got. Generally speaking, there's 2 sources of light, tungsten and daylight. Tungsten are your yellowy sort of lights that are usually in like ceilings or lamps or stuff like that. Daylight is, well, it's daylight. These 2 light sources have different colors. Tungsten is more yellow and daylight is more blue, again, because of physics. The color shifts are measured in Kelvin. Tungsten is at 3200 Kelvin and daylight is at 5600 Kelvin. There are other light sources like fluorescent lights, which sit at around 4000 Kelvin. White balance is used to make sure it's sitting as close to white as possible by adding blues to tungsten or adding oranges to daylight. I don't have a white piece of paper. Frick. If you hold up a white piece of paper, it should look white regardless of the light source. In editing later, you can make it look however you want, but it's best to use the right white balance just to keep it as clean as possible. The only other thing to keep in mind is that if you are using different light sources, you're never going to get both of them to be white. Unless it's a specific stylistic choice, you should probably try and avoid this. Okay, so now that you've got some sort of understanding of what these different settings do, I'll explain how to actually use them to get the type of image that you want. I'll start with video because it's easier to explain considering you shouldn't really be changing much. For starters, this is what you don't want. Everything is in focus because of the closed f-stop. The shutter speed is really low, so it looks like stop motion. And to compensate for the really low light you get from both of those things, I've had to put the ISO way up, which as you can see makes the image really, really grainy. It looks awful, right? If we put it back to a low ISO to keep the image really clean, the right shutter angle of 180 and a nice low f-stop to get some nice blurriness in the background, it looks way better. Of course, you won't always be shooting in a studio setting like this, so let's try some more practical examples. If you're shooting outside and it's really bright, you'll find that you'll lose a lot of the image if it's overexposed and you won't be able to fix it later in post. The first thing you can do is put the ISO as low as it goes to make it less sensitive. If you need more, the next best thing to do is lower the f-stop. Unfortunately, this means everything will be in focus, but it's better than a blown out image. As a last resort, you can lower the shutter angle to let less light in, but you'll lose the perfect motion blur and it'll start to look more like stop motion. The biggest way to solve the focus and shutter speed problems in bright light is to use an ND filter, which is basically sunglasses for the camera. You can get sets of stops like 4, 8, 16, and 32, or you can get a variable ND filter. This means that you can have a 180-degree shutter angle and a low f-stop for the cinematic depth of field in the focus, and then you can just adjust the ND filter until the highlights aren't clipping. If you're shooting at night and it's dark, it's a little bit more difficult. Of course, the first thing to do is to open up the f-stop as open as you can. If this isn't enough, the next thing to do would be to bump up your ISO. If you have a dual ISO like we talked about before, take advantage of it to get a cleaner image. If you don't have a dual ISO, make it as sensitive as you want to before you don't like how much grain there is in the image. You can also open the shutter angle to let more light in, but the image will end up really motion blurry unless the subject isn't moving, so it's best to leave this until last. For photography, it gets a little bit more complicated because you don't have a set shutter speed. You have to combine these 3 settings in the perfect order to get the type of image that you want. Opposite to video, the thing you'll be changing most is the shutter speed, and you're aiming to keep your ISO as low as you can and your f-stop as open as you can. Generally speaking, you want as fast of a shutter speed as you can depending on the light so that you get as clean of an image as possible without motion blur. Let's try some examples. Here's a picture of me taken from a tripod with the wrong settings. A closed aperture for less light and everything in focus, this time with a low ISO and a long shutter speed. I'm in focus and the camera is on a tripod, but because I was moving around, the sensor added the light of me in all the spots that saw me in the time the shutter was open. If we try again with an open aperture, low ISO and shortest shutter speed, we get a much cleaner image with good depth of field in the background. If you're in broad daylight, for a clean image, it's pretty easy. Low aperture, low ISO, and a really fast shutter speed. Because of the amount of light, you can open up the shutter for as short as you need and you won't get any motion blur. If you're shooting at night, again, it's a little bit more difficult. Open up the aperture as wide as you can, maybe bump up the ISO a little bit, and then increase the shutter speed until there is enough light. The biggest thing to note of all of these situations is the light. If you have any control of the light, you can change it so that you can use the settings you specifically want to use. If you can control the light, you can control your settings to be exactly what you want them to be and get exactly the type of image you want. Right, so there's the settings and there's a general idea of how to use them. So here's a quick recap. ISO is the sensor's sensitivity to light. Shutter speed and shutter angle is motion blur. F-stop, also known as aperture and iris, that's your depth of field. Generally speaking, you want this open for a blurry background. White balance is keeping a clean white image for coloring later on. For video, keep your shutter speed at double the frame rate or 180 degrees to get the right amount of motion blur. If you're outside, use an ND filter so that you don't have to change all your settings just for the exposure. For photos, open the f-stop for nice depth of field and have as fast of a shutter speed as you can for clean images. You can swap that for long exposure. And the light, change it as much as you can to get the type of image that you want. Thanks for watching. I hope this helped you in some kind of way. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment and I'll reply to it with an answer if I can answer it. And otherwise, have a good day.